Hello, my name is David Rohl, and I'm an Egyptologist, an archaeologist, and also a historian of the ancient world in general. But I'm also a lecturer for Viking from the enrichment program. So my interest there, and what I usually do when I give my talks on Vikings, talk about ancient legends of the Mediterranean civilizations. So, for instance, the Trojan War story. Did Homer invent that, or was that a real event? These days, I think most archaeologists would agree there really was a Trojan War. And what about the story of Atlantis? Well, today, we believe that has something to do with the eruption of Santorini, ancient Thera, and the collapse of the Minoan civilization. So these are the types of things I give lectures on the cruises around the Mediterranean. But today we're going to talk about something very different. We're going to talk about the Egyptian Genesis, the beginnings of Egyptian history. How did it all begin? The birth of Egyptian civilization is the key to understanding how the pharaonic civilization evolved in the future dynasties. So we can start with the lecture now. The title of the lecture is called The Egyptian Genesis, and it has a subtitle, Archaeological Evidence for the Foundation of the Pharaonic State. And what I mean by the Pharaonic State is the state of Egypt, the civilization of Egypt, which began with the pharaohs. Prior to that, we call it the pre-dynastic period or pre-dynastic age. But then the kings of Egypt appear, and we call those, of course, pharaohs. So let's delve into this in a little bit more detail. So how did it all begin? Now, we do have a series of creation myths by the Egyptians. They go from the earliest period all the way through to the Ptolemaic or Greco-Roman period, where we have these myths about how it all began. And I want to start really by giving you a quote from one of my books that I wrote back in the 1990s called The Genesis of Civilization. And this sort of encapsulates really what was happening at this era. It's a remarkable thing that we're going to be talking about today. The origins of pharaonic civilization have always been shrouded in mystery. What caused dynastic culture to burst forth in the Nile Valley within such a relatively short period of time? It has long been recognized that the emergence of pharaonic rule coincided with an entirely unprecedented series of phenomena, which then formed the recognizable foundation of what we identify as pharaonic Egypt. Okay, so that's quite a clever way of putting it. What we're going to do now is look at what that evidence is for all these things that happen at this moment in time. So I'm going to give you a list now, and we're going to actually cover these as we go through the talk today. So some of them you'll not really be familiar with the terminologies. It's not an era that you'll be familiar with. It's not like the time of Tutankhamun or Ramesses II or Cleopatra. We're talking about a very mysterious period, a sort of almost like a dark age beginning when Egyptian civilization suddenly emerges out of nowhere. So these are the sorts of things that appear at this time. We have something called decorated log-handled pottery. I'll show you one or two of those later on. They appear here at the first time. Archaeologists recognize that as one of the signals for this change that's happening. We have the appearance of stone vessels. So they're able to actually cut and drill out of stone vessels like jars and pots, etc. We have what we call zoomorphic vessels. That means vessels which are made to look like animals. We have little statues, of course, of animals as well, but also vessels which look like bulls or birds, etc., that are carved at this time very intricately. And something you can see on the left-hand side here, we have these elaborate slate palettes, which these strange monsters on them, very strange creatures. That all appears at this time as well. They're a ceremonial thing. They're not practical, but they are something that appears at this era, and something that to do with warfare as well. They introduced something called the pear-shaped mace head. Now, normally a mace is on a stick with a ball around the top. Well, this actually changes in one particular period of time, and it gives the advantage of the incoming people who are carrying this new invention. Military standards also occur at this time as well. So the tribes or the clans are carrying these standards on poles with different insignia on the top of them, which represent the different tribes. And we have something which is going to play a major role in this story today. We have the appearance of something called high-prowed boats, a very distinctive type of boat, which is also associated with Egyptian funerary boats of a later period. Mud brick architecture. Now that appears for the first time in Egypt. Believe it or not, prior to this, nobody had thought of using mud bricks, but now suddenly they turn up in Egypt in this pre-dynastic period. And An even elaborate form of this mud brick architecture appears, what we call niched palace facade architecture or niched facade architecture. And I'll show you examples of that too. Now that is an invention from Mesopotamia, from ancient Sumer. So we're beginning to see possible connections between the land of the two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, Mesopotamia, and Egypt at this period. And of course, early writing, which defines when history begins really. Prior to the invention of writing, we're in prehistory. When we get to the stage where people can actually document things and write things down, then we call that history. So this is that boundary between prehistory and history. And it's when writing is invented for the first time. Again, that was invented first in Mesopotamia. And finally, there's kingship. Now, kingship is something that is a very elaborate form of chieftainship. So we begin with early chieftains in this era, and then suddenly we have pharaohs for the first time in Egypt. And so all the governmental departments that go with that idea of kingship are there. So it's a very, very important mark in terms of civilization. So let's look at the timeline just to have a look really what we're dealing with here. And we're just dealing with that early period now. Now you're going to get terms you've not heard of before, but these are archaeological terms. Nakada was an archaeological site that was excavated by Flinders Peter, the great Egyptologist from Britain, one of the earliest excavators in Egypt. And he came across this site called Nakada, and he excavated there, and he divided it up into three periods, the first of which started around 4,400 BC, and he dubbed Nakada 1. That was followed by Nakada 2 around 3,500 BC. But what marks the difference between those two periods is the appearance of Mesopotamian artifacts and contact. So there is a marked change between Nakada 1, which seems to be an indigenous archaeology, and then something happening in Nakada 2. We have contact with foreigners at this time. And that is even greater when we get to Nakada 3, around 3,200 BC, because then we have this very, very major contact between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Something big happened at that point in time. Now, if we compare that to when that is in terms of dynasties, or dynasties, it's around the time when Dynasty 0 occurs. Now, Dynasty 0 is something we've tacked on as Egyptologists because we didn't know about it. We thought it all began with Dynasty 1, but now we found pharaohs of Dynasty 0. So the Nakada 3 period is when Dynasty 0 and Dynasty 1 existed in Egypt. So we're now into the pharaonic period with Nakada 3. Prior to that is the pre-dynastic period. So that's the era of Nakada 1 and Nakada 2. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at today, the archaeology and the history behind those particular periods. Now, one of the great myths of ancient Egypt, of course, is the idea that Thoth, the great god of knowledge and writing, brought those things to Egypt, introduced Egypt to writing and knowledge and science and all those things that would be Egyptian magic, I suppose you would call them. And here you see the god Thoth, the ibis god, giving the pharaoh the Ankh sign to his nostrils to bring life to the pharaoh, the deceased pharaoh. So at this time, Thoth is a key individual in terms of the Egyptian mythology. Now, later in the Hellenistic period and the Roman period, of course, it evolves into something called Hermetica, because Hermes, the Greek god Hermes, is also associated with the Egyptian god Thoth. So it comes from Thoth into the classical world, so to speak, and esoteric knowledge is all associated with this god Thoth or Hermes. The Egyptians themselves referred to this quite differently. They referred to this era Septepi, which basically means the first time that things began to happen in Egypt, a magical period before the pharaohs. Now, to learn about this period and the myth behind it, or we might even call it a legend now, we have to go to Edfu, the great temple of Horus in Upper Egypt. This is a Ptolemaic or Greco-Roman temple, but it has inscriptions and reliefs high up on the building where nobody can see them about the gods who brought knowledge to Egypt, and there are in fact 8 of them altogether. So they actually are called the Sheptiu gods. That's not a phrase you would normally read in an Egyptological book or popular book. These Sheptiu gods are the creator gods of Egypt. They're the ones that bring civilization to Egypt. And you have to find the evidence for these gods way up in the pronaos of the temple. Here you see We were filming a TV series called The Egyptian Genesis in 2001, and we were able to get up onto the walls of the temple and actually see the relief. It's this one above the outer wall on the side of the pronaos, where you can't actually see it if you're just standing on the floor at the bottom of the temple. So it's actually hidden away. But we managed to go up there and film it, and I want to show you what it actually shows. So on the right-hand side, we have the pharaoh, in this case a Ptolemaic Greco-Roman pharaoh, worshipping the falcon god Horus, who is standing on a bunch of reeds. Now, that bunch of reeds is actually part of what we call the abyss, or the Abzu, which is a freshwater swamp surrounding a circular island, which is basically the island of creation in Egyptian mythology. And Horus is standing on the reeds surrounding that island. And the gods, the great Shebtiu gods, are seated on their thrones on the island of creation, the primeval mound. Now, I want to show you three of those gods, the first three in the list that we have here, because they're quite important to give us a clue as to what's going on here. The first one is called Wa, and that means the distant one. Now, funny enough, that one of the ideas behind the name of Horus is also that he is the distant one. So it may well be that this is the human representation of the falcon god Horus. The next character is called Aa, which means the Great One. Now, that's a title that was given to Thoth. Thrice great is how he's described. So it may well be that this is the Thoth figure, the god figure for Thoth. And the third god here, and the one that's most interesting for me, is one called Nai. Now, Nai is the word for sailor in ancient Egyptian. So it has something, we believe, to do with ships. Ocean-going ships, probably, because these gods came from afar, according to the texts. So we have navigation involved here. We have a journey by boat. And that's what we'll be looking at when we come to the rock art in the desert later on. Now, there are the full 8 on their thrones, and I want to show you now the epithets that associated with these Shebtiu gods. Well, they're called the August Shebtiu, which basically means senior ones. That's what Shebtiu means. They're called the children of Tar-Chenen. Now, Tar-Chenen is the ancient Egyptian word for the risen land, or primeval mound of creation. So this mound comes out of the waters of the abyss, the Abzu, which is the swamp region, with the reeds growing out of it. So this is almost like the beginnings of creation in the Egyptian theology. They're called the offspring of the creator god. And the creator god in ancient Egypt was Atum. So that's very important. They're also called the glorious spirits of the early primeval age. So again, this is Septepi, the first time. So they are spirit gods, but they're also obviously some sort of humans as well. They're called the builder gods because they build great temples. They're architects. They're clever people who are able to construct mud brick temples. And they're also called the brethren of the sages. Now, in Mesopotamian mythology, there are 7 of these sages. They're called Apkallu, and the 8th one, of course, is Thoth himself. So the text we see here, which is above the seated figures here, actually refers to Thoth and the 7 sages. So the god Thoth is part of these 8 gods, the Shebtiu gods. Now, one of the questions that always surprised me when I was a kid looking at ancient Egypt was why the pharaohs had these huge strapped-on beards, false beards attached to their chins. Because, you don't expect people in northern Africa to have great beards. So why do the pharaohs wear these huge beards, and false beards at that? Well, it seems to have some association with the early gods, because the early gods in Egyptian pantheon and also in Mesopotamia had these great beards as well. So it's maybe a connection looking back to this primeval age, which gives the pharaohs the authority of gods to rule over the land. The other thing we see is the funerary boats of the kings when they go to their graves or their pyramids. In this case, this is Khufu's funerary boat. We have these big boats with what we call a high prow, vertical prow, and an incurved stern at the back. They also have cabins on them, and these usually are where the body of the pharaoh is carried across the Nile to the west, where the pharaoh is buried in his tomb or in his pyramid. They are very interesting, this particular shape of boat. We also see it in the art of the tombs themselves in the Valley of the Kings, where we see the pharaoh. Now he's in his boat with the high prow and the incurved stern, and he's been escorted by the followers of Horus. That's the standard we see here, the man carrying the falcon god, and in front of him the twin plumes standard. And they are actually traveling through the underworld for rebirth on the eastern horizon with the sun. So there's a journey involved here through the underworld in one of these high-prowed boats that the pharaoh has to take to be reborn on the eastern horizon. We also see in the tombs that the pharaoh, in this case, he's personified by the god Atum, the ram-headed god, in a cabin, in a high-prowed boat with an incurved stern, and he's being dragged along the desert floor by his crew. So this journey doesn't just involve being on the sea or on the river, it also involves traveling across the desert, across the sand. And that will mean a lot to you when we come to the next part of the talk. So when we look at the Egyptian idea of the creation and also of rebirth, we look to the east. Now, the east from the Egyptian perspective is what we call the Eastern Desert, between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea. And that's what you have here. This is the Eastern Desert, a very mountainous region with lots of flat wadis, which you can traverse to get from the Red Sea to the Nile and vice versa. And of course, you look across from the Nile to the Red Sea and you see the sunrise from there. So resurrection lies in the east, as far as the Egyptian theology is concerned, on a place called the Isle of Flame. Now, the Isle of Flame basically is some concept that they have of a fiery place. And when you watch the sunrise on the eastern horizon, you're looking to a place the Egyptians call Lightland because of the glow of the sun just before it appears on the horizon. So all this is about the east. Resurrection and rebirth is in the east in the Egyptian mind. So if we're going to find out more about this, we need to look in the desert itself. And there are things in the desert which are quite remarkable, which have been known about for the past 60 or 70 years, but really not been studied very well. So we're going to go into the Eastern Desert now, and I'm going to show you rock art, which helps us to understand this story, this legend. So here we have on the right side, this dark area, that's the Red Sea area, and we have the Nile Valley in Upper Egypt. There's the city of Thebes and Abydos. Down here we have the Temple of Edfu, and down below we have Aswan and Lake Nasser. And in between the Red Sea and the Nile, we have the Eastern Desert. And as you can see from this satellite image, it's actually very mountainous. It's not a flat desert like the Sahara you could see on the west side. It's very mountainous, and there are lots of places where you find wadis with these rock carvings in the desert. So we're going to go and have a look at those now. Now, there are two transverse wadis that go from the Red Sea to the Nile or the other way. One is the Wadi Hammamat in the north around Thebes, and the other one is the Wadi Abad, which comes out at Edfu. Now, those are the main routes that you would travel if you were coming from the Red Sea to the Nile. And they both happen to be where the first two great chieftainships of Egypt also occur. So here's a map, a simplified map. The kingdom of Seth, the god of chaos, is in the north, opposite the Wadi Hammamat. And the kingdom of Horus, the tribe of Horus, is based opposite the Wadi Abad at a place called Nekhen, which is very close to Edfu. So what we see in the Temple of Edfu relates to this early period of time. So we're going to go into the desert to the east side of those two kingdoms, both of which also happen to be areas of gold in Egypt, where the gold mining took place. So we're going to follow in the footsteps of a guy called Arthur Weigel, who was a British archaeologist, Egyptologist, and he went out to the desert in 1907, and he wrote a book about his journey there called Travels in the Upper Egyptian Desert in 1909. And he recorded for the very first time the rock art you're going to see now. Now, we went out and did 7 expeditions from 1997 to 2000 in our vehicles, in our 4x4s, to go and resurvey this area, because we don't think that Arthur Weigel got all the rock art, and indeed we found many hundreds of sites that he doesn't even mention in our survey work. And we camp out in the desert for about a week. We can't really do much longer than that because there's no water there. And of course, the food starts to get rather unpleasant after 7 days. So we go out and do 7 days, and then we head for the Red Sea, and we go to a hotel, and we all get showered down, have something nice to eat and some nice drinks. But this is us encamped in the desert. What we did was we followed Arthur Weigel, who happened to take his wife on their honeymoon. He got married to a lady called Hortense, an American lady, and he took her into the Eastern Desert, which was a bit strange to say the least. So he went from Luxor up the River Nile to Edfu, and then he got a couple of camels, and he took his wife on a journey into the wadi there to a place called Kanais, and we're going to go there too. That was always our starting point for our expeditions. And we then surveyed the entire area that you see here in red, which is a large area where we found hundreds and hundreds of rock art sites in that part of the world. And you see it's between the very, very mountainous area and the more broken up area of limestone. This is the perfect area for carving on rock at this particular part of the world. Now, when we get to Kanais, we find there's a temple cut into the cliff face. And it was actually built by Seti I, the father of Ramesses II, to commemorate the digging of a well for expeditions which came this way to the gold mines. But that's not what we're interested in today. We're interested in what happened much, much earlier than that. There's our temple on the right-hand side. What we want to look at is that great big rock surface to the left of the temple. There we found hundreds of rock carvings, and these are the ones that Arthur Weigel discovered as well on his honeymoon. Here's one of our survey guys climbing up the cliff face to examine these very, very worn and now darkened into the rock again because they're thousands of years old carvings. But what I'm going to show you now is what we find on the rock surface here. We find lots and lots of boats. Now, most of these boats are typical of these high prow, high stern boats, and they also have people in, and some of those people have raised arms above their heads. It's a typical scene, what we see there. They also have central cabins in them, and they have crews with oars. You can see here stick figures. The crew is represented at the top, and below we have the oars, and they have animals in them as well, and they have palm fronds on the prow, so we know which is the front and which is the back. But also in the art, we have the animals of the Eastern Desert in this period when Egypt was much wetter than it is today, or in fact even in the pharaonic period. So we have things like ostriches and elephants and antelopes and even hippopotami that are found in the desert in this prehistoric period. So it wasn't that it was completely desert, it was in fact a sort of savanna region, a mountainous savanna region, but there were animals here in water holes, and so you could sustain yourself if you crossed the desert by hunting or whatever method you want to do. And there would be water supplies as well in the region. Now here we are actually examining one of the boats at this particular site of Kanais, and I want to go into a little bit more detail now about what we're looking at. So let's take this boat as an example. Now you can see it's very, very worn back into the rock. The patination, we call it, has been darkened again from its original light color to almost back to the suntan of the original rock surface. But if I highlight it a little bit for you, so I'll darken the surface a little bit behind it, you can now see more clearly what we're looking at. So here we have a large figure standing there with the arms above his head. He's also got plumes on his head, there's 4 in this case. His crew is represented by stick figures and the oars below, and there's a central cabin, and it has an incurved stern and a straight prow, which some strange object on it here, we're not sure what that is, and what appears to be an animal motif at the back, attached to the back. So this is typical of the sort of thing we see in the desert in this prehistoric period. But we also see much, much bigger boats. Now here's a very, very large boat with 48 stick figures in. So this is a ship capable of carrying 48 men in it. So this was virtually an army. We also have fleets of ships, not just one, but several ships all coming together in the desert, and again with large crews, and sometimes with a central figure standing there like a chieftain figure or a leader. Here's an example again with again about 50 crew and a large figure standing in the middle. So these are not funerary boats that we see in ancient Egypt later on. These have a militaristic character to them. They are people coming into Egypt, and we're pretty sure of that, arriving in this prehistoric period, and in large numbers, not just a few at a time. This is an example of one of the drawings which we made in the survey, and you can see here the men are rowing the boat. It's got a vertical prow. It has these palm fronds on the outside, what appears to be a bird located with wings at the front. And on the back, there's a bull with some strange horn configuration, or a bovid of some kind. But notice that there are two figures standing here, and one of them is pointing in the direction the boat is going. And every time we find one of these guys pointing, it's always pointing to the Nile Valley. So we never see them pointing in the other direction to the Red Sea. It's almost like they're saying, this is the way we're going toward the Nile from the Red Sea. Here's another example. With this guy, in this case, he's got two large plumes on his head, and he's also pointing towards the Nile Valley. There's another bird on the prow here, it would appear, and there's a central cabin, which seems to be some sort of bird again inside a sun disk. So this is very interesting. Could it be a representation of Horus, perhaps? This is one of the nicest boats we found in the desert. It's a lovely boat. And again, you see the man with the raised arms over his head, the incurved stern, the high prow with the palm fronds, the crew, and the central cabin. So this is typical of what we find. Here's one that's very, very difficult to see. So again, I'm going to remove the background so that you can see it more clearly. And again, you see the figure with the high prows and the twin plumes. You have the cabin. You have a bull or boat on the back of the boat this time with the incurved stern, and on the front you have the palm fronds again. So this is exactly the sort of thing we see all the time. So that bull is quite interesting, if he's a bull. Of course, it might be a female bovid. We also then see in the palettes we find at the beginning of this period, the slate palettes, we see representations of the pharaoh or the king as a bull defeating his enemies. So the bull is associated with the pharaoh. In fact, the pharaoh wears a bull's tail at the back to show that he is the bull, the wild bull of the herd, of the Egyptian herd. And you also see there's a rope coming down here with standards with the symbols of the different clans here. And they have hands at the end of the stands, and they're gripping the rope, and they're actually pulling something. Well, what they were pulling is broken away from this pallet. We don't actually see what it is, but I bet you bottom dollar it was a boat. So if I turn it round now, you can see more clearly that you have the hands grasping the rope and the standards here. And so we have these motifs here. This is Wet, who's the opener of the ways. He's a navigator god. He's in the form of a jackal. So he could be this navigator, this Nai that we had earlier on, this sailor. And then we have here we have Anubis. Then we have the god Thoth, and we have the god Horus, the falcon god. And here the symbol for the god Min, the desert god. So we can identify who these followers of Horus are, who are supporting the king, the wild bull, in his conquest of the enemies. So here we are heading into the desert, large team of usually 6 or 7 vehicles. And we go on our journey, and we go to the various parts of the desert which have not been visited by Arthur Weigel. In this case, there was a later scholar called Hans Winkler, a German archaeologist, who organized something called the Robert Mond expedition in 1938, just before the war started. And he did the area further north, the Wadi Hammamat area. That's the northern route, as it were, from the Red Sea to the Nile. And he found lots of sites. You can see them all marked on his plan here. And I'm going to take you to this little red dot at the bottom, which is very interesting because it's a major site. And it actually took us several expeditions to find it in the first place. It looks like it's pretty easy to find when you look at a map like that. And if you go close in, oh yeah, that must be easy. We just go down this wadi here, and then we'll arrive down here at site 26, which is the one we tried to find. But as I say, we found it very, very difficult to find it. And I'll show you why now, because this is a modern map of the terrain, just for that little tiny bit down there. And it looks like this. Now you can probably see why it was so difficult to locate this tiny little square down here, which is site 26 in that yellow rectangle there. So the route to that site, we did find eventually on the 3rd expedition, is through here. So it's really tricky to locate. But when you get there, you see something fantastic. So here's the team arriving at this site, RME, Robert Mond Expedition Site 26. And it's on this surface here where you can see the people gathering, the surveyors gathering, and it's a beautiful surface to work on. It's nice and flat, it's like a cliff face. And what we find there is it's covered in rock art with one very special boat in the middle. And here I am to give you an idea of the scale here. So it's about 1.5 meters long and about 1 meter high, and it contains remarkable figures, this one. So let's go into it a little bit closer. I will take the background away again for you. And so we're looking at a flat bottom boat with a high prow, and this time a high stern, not an incurved stern, with 2 adults and 3 children in there. The adults are carrying bows in their hands, and they have 2 plumes on their heads. And these 3 figures here are obviously the children. Now, who are these? Is this family? Is it some sort of deity family? Is it a family of gods, or is it a family of kings and queens and their children who are coming to Egypt? We don't know, but it's unique, this particular rock art here. We don't see this anywhere else in the Eastern Desert. We also find, interestingly enough, representations of these boats on sledges. So here is the Horus Falcon in the central cabin, and this crescent-shaped boat in this case is being dragged along. Here's the dragging crew here, pulling the boat along through the desert on a sledge. So that tells you that this sort of thing was going on. So let's just summarize this part of the talk first of all. The high-prowed reed boats were coming from the Red Sea. The ships were dragged from the sea to the Nile, as far as we can tell. They arrived in Upper Egypt, that's the south of Egypt, and then conquered Lower Egypt, the north. So they came in across the desert, and then they moved themselves northwards up the River Nile to conquer the other parts of Egypt. Some of them may then have sailed on to the land of Canaan, what the Bible calls Canaan, which then becomes Phoenicia in our ancient history. So there is a strong connection between the people of the Nile at this time and the Phoenicians, or the predecessors of the Phoenicians, what we call the Canaanites, who have a close connection to Egypt. These people are described in the book of Genesis passage about the dispersion of the nations following the abandonment of the Tower of Babel. So if you read the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis, after the tower is abandoned and nobody works on it anymore, the people disperse, they leave, and they travel to different parts of the world. And there's a part of that where the sons of Ham, who's a son of Noah, travel to North Africa, to the Egypt and the land of Cush in the south modern Sudan. So we're now going to look at the evidence itself in terms of the archaeology of Egypt. So this is where we start to see real artifacts that tell us a little bit more about these people. Archaeological evidence for Mesopotamia in early Egypt. So let's look at a few Mesopotamian things now. This is actually the shrine of Inanna, the goddess Inanna, in ancient Sumer in southern Iraq. It's a reed shrine with these palm fronds sticking out the top. This symbol here is the symbol of Inanna, and she is a mother goddess who's also a goddess of nurturing animals. So you see sheep coming to the shrine. Now that particular shape is very interesting. We find that in Mesopotamia a lot, this particular type of reed construction. It's called a modif today, and they even still build them. Here is an example of a grand modif, the interior of it, from the Marsh Arabs who live in southern Iraq today. Now in Egypt, we see these things copied in stone. This is the complex of King Zoser, 3rd dynasty pharaoh. Now, this is the first time that stone's used in this way in ancient Egypt. And what they do is they try to copy reed structures, which are very similar to what we see in Mesopotamia. So here's a Mesopotamian version of the same thing in reeds. So it's quite clear that in Egypt, they started with these reed structures. They then made them in wood. And then for the eternity, as it were, in the funerary architecture of the pharaohs, they built them in eternal stone. So they're copying what was in the cities of Egypt, which were wooden versions, predecessors reed versions, but now they're in eternal stone. And they're actually dummy shrines because they're actually solid. You can't go into them. They're just solid stone. So now we turn to William Matthew Flinders Petrie, I mentioned earlier, who excavated this site of Nakada in 1893. And I'm going to show you what he found there. This is him here. And these types of pots we see, this buffware pottery, is very typical of Nakada 2, the second phase. And you'll notice that it's got ships in it and also mountains, stylized mountains, and animals. So what he found was that there's a cemetery there called Cemetery T of elite burials, not ordinary burials. These are tribal chieftains, important individuals, and their tombs, remarkably, are lined in mud brick. So we're talking about the second half of the 4th millennium BC, and we can see the mud bricks lining the tombs. This is the first time we see mud bricks used in ancient Egypt in the prehistoric period. Before this, they just dig a hole in the ground, they put the body in. Now we're lining the tombs with mud bricks. And so this is Ginger for the British Museum, who's a typical Nakada 2 individual burial. And you see this type of buffware pottery in his burial here. And he's mummified naturally by the dry sand. It's not a proper mummification in this particular case. But he's part of this cemetery we talk about at Nakada. And I talked to you about these zoomorphic animal shapes made of stone, elaborate pieces of stone. Here's an example of a couchant bovid, a bull, lying down. And here we see stone vessels, which now you know what a lug handle is. This is a lug handle here where they would put string or rope through so they could carry the jar on a stick or across the shoulders with 2 jars. That's what the lug handles are for. But you can see they're very fine work, and they are done in the prehistoric period. These are carved out of hard stone in the prehistoric era. And here we see a pottery version of a long-handled vessel with, as I say, the crescent-shaped boat now with the oars, and in this case has 2 cabins on it, and of course the mountain scenery behind. The other thing that appears at this time, which is very strange, is cylinder seals. Now, these are typical Mesopotamian cylinder seals, but they've got hieroglyphs on them. So they're using the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but the actual thing itself is not a scarab, what you would find normally in Egypt. It's a Mesopotamian cylinder seal, which are being hung around the neck. It would have been strung through and hung around the neck. We find, again, cylinders made of lapis lazuli. Now, lapis lazuli is a very, very precious stone. That the Egyptians loved, and they would import it. You can't find it in Egypt itself. And in fact, this lapis lazuli comes from Badakhshan, which is in part of Afghanistan, eastern Afghanistan. So they're obviously trading with far afield, with the Mesopotamians and possibly with the Indus Valley culture of what we call Pakistan today, the Harappan culture, which is obviously somehow or other making contact, trading contact with Egypt. So these goods are coming in at this particular period. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting on our surveys was this guy here. He's in a high-prowed boat, as you can see. It's got an animal's head on it, and he's got 2 plumes on his head. Let me go a bit closer to show you more detail. He's got the 2 plumes on his head, and he's carrying a pear-shaped mace in his hand. This is the first time we see these pear-shaped maces. But let me look at that in more detail for you. Well, the pear-shaped mace was the weapon par excellence of the pharaohs. Throughout Egyptian history, we find the pharaohs carrying this pear-shaped mace, and they used it to smite their enemies. So it's a very, very significant iconographic motive of pharaonic power. And we see it for the first time with these people coming into Egypt. Prior to that, in Nakada 1, they had these strange disc-shaped maces, which were like a disc, and you wouldn't do a lot of damage with that. But if you club somebody on the head with a pear-shaped mace from Nakada 2, you would crush his skull in and you would kill him. So even this simple little change in technology makes all the difference between a people who are conquered in Nakada 1 and a people who are the conquerors in Nakada 2. Small technology, but it makes all the difference in the world. And here we see a label from the time of the early First Dynasty period, King Den in this particular case, the pharaoh, and he's actually smiting his enemies with a pear-shaped mace. So here you see the pharaohs themselves using this particular weapon. And of course, these pear-shaped maces are not an invention of the Egyptians. They come from Mesopotamia again. They come from the land of Sumer. This is a Mesopotamian pear-shaped mace. And here you see a relief from Mesopotamia of a king smiting his enemies, which are captured in a net here, and he's carrying a pear-shaped mace. So we know that this is an import, an invention that's come from Mesopotamia, which is introduced into Egypt at this time. And on the Nama palette, one of the earliest kings of in fact, the last king of the Dynasty 0 and the first king of the Dynasty 1, if you like. We think maybe his son was the first king of Dynasty 1, Menes. But here he is on his slate palette, carrying his pear-shaped mace. His name is written above his head here, Namer, and here you see a close-up of the pear-shaped mace. And notice he's got a bull's tail attached to his waist, which shows you he's the great bull, the wild bull, the controller of the herd, the master of the animals almost. Behind him, there's a little figure, and he's carrying the king's sandals. So we would call him a sandal bearer. So he's a servant of the king, and these symbols here are two hieroglyphic symbols, Hem Necha, which basically servant of the god king. That's what those symbols mean. So Hem Necha, Hem is the word for servant, and Necha is the word for god. So these are deified monarchs, deified pharaohs, and he is the servant of the god king. We see also King Scorpion, who's from Dynasty 0. Here he is, and he's got his name in front of him. Here's the scorpion in front of his face. And look, he's also got this rosette above his head, which says he's a god king. So his name is written Scorpion, the god king. And that rosette, that I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 petals, is something we see also in Mesopotamia. So let's just summarize what are the significant elements of kingship in this time. Well, one is the pear-shaped mace. He also wears a bull's tail because he's the head of the herd. He has this rosette as a kingly title to give him this idea of divinity. He comes along, and his people, the followers of Horus, the people who come with these kings, come in high proud boats. So now we get on to the religious motives that we find in later Egyptian art, which reflect back to this early period. So again, let's look at this little guy here. He's carrying the sandals of the king. And here we have this rosette, and we have this upturned vessel. Maybe it's a vessel with a mud brick covering or stopper on the top, we're not sure. But this spells out Hem Necha. And that symbol, 1, 2, 3, in this case, six petals, is also seen on this vase from Mesopotamia of Gilgamesh, the famous divine king of Mesopotamia, who is controlling 2 serpents with his hands, and he's standing on the backs of 2 lions. And of course, he has the symbol of the rosette, saying that he's a divine ruler. So this symbol comes from Mesopotamia. It doesn't come from Egypt. But the Egyptian pharaohs use it in this early period to denote their divine kingship. So that is a significant connection to Mesopotamia. The other thing we find in the rock art of the desert are the crews of the vessels dragging the boats. This is one example. I'll come a bit closer for you so you can see it better. In this case, there is a figure on the boat. It's quite a small boat, this one, with raised arms again and 2 plumes on his head, central cabin, incurved stern, high prow, and it has the crew dragging the boat. So this idea of dragging the boat through the desert is there throughout the art. And here's another example, a much bigger boat this time with a big crew. And there is a crew of stick figures pulling the boat along the dry desert. So we have lots of examples of that in the rock art. Here's just a few of them. One interesting one is this one up here, where we have the crew dragging. And this time we have a bovid. Now, we can't say whether it's a bull or a female heifer. It's difficult to say, but we do have this representation in later Egyptian art. So here we are at the temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri. One of the reliefs there, it's not easy to make it out. So again, I'm going to darken the background for you so you can see it clearly. So what we have is a high-prowed boat. Notice that it's a reed boat because it's tied together with the clumps of reeds at the front. And in it there is a bovid. In this case, it's the goddess Hathor, the golden one, who is being carried in a high-prowed reed ship. And look at the bottom here. We have a wooden sledge with a rope attached to it, which is being dragged. And what you don't see on the right-hand side of the scene is the crew, or the priests in this case, dragging this ship across the ground. So they're pulling Hathor in her reed ship across the ground, across the desert. And we see this in the funerals of the kings. So here we see again a high proud boat with an anchor, a central cabin with the mummy of the ruler inside and the priest in front of it. And you'll notice again, it's on a sledge with a rope attached to the front of the sledge. So again, the scene shows them dragging this boat along for the funeral of the king to the Valley of the Kings, where the king is to be buried. So they didn't bring the kings on chariots or on carts. They dragged them on reed boats, or copies of reed boats, as it were, probably made of wood, in their shrines to their funeral in the Valley of the Kings. Now, you think to yourself, well, you know, could they have dragged these big boats across the desert? Well, we have a representation here, for instance, of people, the Egyptians, dragging a huge statue from the desert, which had been carved in the desert and was being dragged to its final location. So they were quite capable of doing this. And in fact, we know this for a fact, because these massive pillars that you see here, this is one that cracked when it was in the quarry in the eastern desert, so they decided to abandon it. But the others that they carved out here from the rock were dragged through the desert to the Nile and put on barges where they sailed out into the Mediterranean, and they were used in places like the Pantheon in Rome. So they come from the eastern desert, the columns of the Pantheon. So these massive objects, if they could drag those, they could certainly drag reed ships through the desert as well. So let's now look at this foreign contact in more detail. This is a Mesopotamian god you see here. This is in fact Enki, the god of the freshwater springs. A very interesting god in his own right. Now on one of the palettes, this is the palette again of King Nama. This is the full palette now. I showed you only this top left-hand corner before, and the original. This is a line drawing now. But we have this amazing scene below of intertwined panthers with long necks, antithetical, facing each other, and their necks wind together, and we have panther heads on them. It's an extraordinary motif, which is just certainly not Egyptian. You can't regard this as Egyptian. This is something foreign. And we know where it comes from, because this is a cylinder seal impression from Mesopotamia, where you have exactly the same thing. You have two antithetical beasts with intertwined necks and panther heads, exactly like the Egyptian version. So we know that this motif is Mesopotamian. So again, we have to ask the question, why all these Mesopotamian motifs in the early phases of Egyptian civilization? A very interesting knife was dug up at the western end of the Wadi Hammamat in that northern route across from the Red Sea to the Nile. And it's made of hippopotamus ivory at the top and flint at the bottom. But I want you to take a close look at the handle itself. So I've got a line drawing of it here, and it's got two sides to it. One side has this astonishing figure, a master of animals, just like Gilgamesh, controlling two lions. But he's not an Egyptian figure. He's got a long kilt or gown on, and he's got a long beard. I mentioned to you before about the big false beards of the pharaohs, and he's wearing a chignon or headband around his head. Now, on the right-hand side, we have a battle scene, and here we have a captive being led away with long hair, being led away by the victor with short hair, carrying a pear-shaped mace. So it seems there was some sort of conflict at this time where the long-haired Nilotic peoples were being defeated by the short-haired foreigners with their pear-shaped maces. If we look lower down, we see high-prowed boats with central cabins and standards, and this high-prowed boat seems to have a stone weight in it for some reason to hold the prow into the water, and this strange mechanism at the back, the support mechanism. And then below we have the Nilotic peoples drowning in the Nile with their crescent-shaped boats underneath. So they had crescent-shaped boats to sail on the river, whereas these foreigners here with the pear-shaped mace and with a leader who looks like a foreigner, a Mesopotamian god or king, and they are coming into Egypt and they are defeating the Nilotic peoples in their crescent-shaped boats. And here we see again Gilgamesh controlling two lions in exactly the same way as you see on the Jebel al-Iraq knife. Now this character with the beard and the chignon and the kilt or whatever it is, he appears a lot in Mesopotamian art. He actually worships at the shrine of Inanna. Again, you see the motif of Inanna's shrine here. This character turns up all the time in in Mesopotamian art. And here he is again. this time on a flat bottom boat with a high prow and an incurved stern. And it's got the portable shrine of Inanna being carried on the back of an ox here. So this is probably something that was going on on the river Euphrates. But what I want you to notice is the shape of the boat. So here we have on the Jebel al-Araq knife, the ivory knife, you have this boat of the victors with the central cabin and the crescent with the rising sun. You'll notice the high prow with the stone in the front, and look at the mechanism at the back, the support mechanism with the struts. And you have exactly the same thing on this figure in the Euphrates, this bearded figure with the chignon, and you have the same thing at the back, even as far as having the loop at the back represented exactly the same way. And in this case, no stone in it, but you also have this sort of cage mechanism to hold an object in the front. So it's quite clear that the Jebel al-Araq knife with these boats on is very similar to what you find in Mesopotamian art in this period. So this priest king of Uruk is referred to, the city of Uruk in Mesopotamia, a very important city at this period, is portrayed as a master of animals. He's also shown hunting, by the way. He has a very heavy gown on him. He has a full beard, just like the pharaoh's false beards. He has this chignon headdress around him, around supporting his head. And he's also seen as a hunter with a bow and also a spear. This is one of him representing killing an animal with a spear, but he's also shown with a bow as well. And he travels around in a high-prowed boat. So there seems to be strong connections between ancient Egypt, the prehistoric Egypt, and the early dynastic period in Egypt, and these Mesopotamians, but it goes a lot further than that. This is the iconographic crown of Upper Egypt, of the south, the white crown of Upper Egypt. The northern crown was the red crown, and it was a completely different shape. Now, this is a typical example of what it looks like. It's most peculiar. You wouldn't expect to see a crown like that, but you do in ancient Egypt. And we find it on this cylinder seal impression. Let me just take a sip of water. This shows a battle. You can see the arrows flying and the men with their shields. And here the king is standing with his shield in front of him. And again, he's got the two symbols, the symbols of the hem and the necha. So it's the titles of this guy behind him who is carrying the standard. He's the servant of the divine king. So this is a divine king here. And you'll notice he's wearing a high white crown, just like you have on the Egyptian motifs of the kings. Down here below is his queen being carried in a palanquin. But this is not from Egypt. This cylinder seal impression comes from Susiana, which is part of Mesopotamia. It's the southern Iranian part of Mesopotamia. So it's quite clear that the white crown actually originates also in Mesopotamia, not in Egypt. And if we look at our god again, our god Enki, and we take away the horns which are wrapped around his crown, and we remove them, we see that underneath is exactly the same crown, the white crown, same shape. So it clears that it's quite apparent that the gods of ancient Mesopotamia have the same crown as the divine pharaohs in this early period and all the way throughout Egyptian history. When we talk about public art, same sort of thing. The architecture here, this is Mesopotamian art from Kish, building structures. I told you about the Shebtu being builder gods, and it's all mud brick, and it's got this strange niched pattern on it. Let me show you another example from Uruk. You see this niched facade architecture running along the outside of the buildings. Now that is typically Mesopotamian. Here we see a reconstruction from Uruk of the main temple there, the White Temple, with the niched facade architecture, even on the platform below the actual temple itself. So the Mesopotamians invented niched facade architecture. And lo and behold, it appears in the first dynasty of Egypt. This is one of the tombs at Saqqara, and you see the niched facade architecture. Let me go in close to an example of it. It's plastered surface, but you see it's a complex, indented structure which runs all the way around the outside of the tombs. And here's the original archaeological photograph of it. And it was painted with beautiful colors representing hangings like cloth materials on the outside, which basically means that this is actually an original reed building which is then made in mud brick and squared off, whereas the reeds are rounded for this particular shape. But in this period, when they start to build in brick, they square off the columns of reeds and the bundles, and they turn it into mud brick architecture we call niche facade architecture. And it goes all the way through Egyptian history, and we get it, of course, exemplified here in the enclosures surrounding the step pyramid of King Zoser, where we see it at its finest with this niched architecture borrowed from Mesopotamia. Another thing that they find in Mesopotamia, especially at Uruk and the Uruk IV period, is this remarkable form of cone mosaic decoration on columns and on the decoration of buildings. Basically, it's coloured cones which are inserted into wet plaster so that they get these wonderful patterns. And this is actually the archaeological remains from Uruk that are now in the Berlin Museum. And we see it also in the same museum again, the same intricate patterning. Now, you'd think that was unique. That's not the sort of thing that somebody could invent independently somewhere else. And lo and behold, it turns up in Egypt. These are the Mesopotamian artifacts here of the cones and the sockets for the cones. And here we have in the delta of Egypt, we have the same thing turning up. Now, that surely is evidence of Mesopotamians in Egypt. There's no way the Egyptians can be independent of Mesopotamia and come up with something as complex and strange as this form of decoration. So these are the cones, the decorated cones that are inserted into the slots. And also we have representations and seals in Mesopotamia of these high-prowed reed ships. You can see the strapping around them. This one is represented with a god at the front. And this is the god Shamash, the god or Utu, the god of the sun, with the rays of the sun coming out of his shoulders. And of course, it's traveling again on the sea. It's a high prow, high stern. So Sumerian Utu, that's the god, the name of the sun god, is Akkadian Shamash or Babylonian Shamash. And that's Al-Shams in Arabic, means the sun. So back to our funerary boat again. Of Khufu, the Great Pyramid, and the ones that we find in the tombs. Let's go a little bit more detail now about this. Well, the first thing to notice is that the prow of the boat, it's wood, but it represents the reed bundle tied together, flared at the top. And again, here you see in the high prow boat in the tomb, here this is in fact in Seti I tomb, and again you have this bundle that is tied together, showing it was originally a reed ship, not a wood ship. So, resurrection lies in the east. And the journey of the pharaoh is going in as a deceased pharaoh. He is on board his ship, his reed ship, represented here by the wooden ship of Khufu. And he goes through the underworld on the dark ocean, and he arrives on the eastern horizon where he's reborn as the sun god, pushed out of the horizon by the Khepri beetle. This symbolism of the sun resurrecting, as it were, as the king himself is resurrected as the sun. So they make a journey. The deceased pharaoh makes a journey to the Isle of Flame where he's reborn, which I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. So if we now stand in Egypt and we look east to the rising sun, we end up at the bottom of the Persian Gulf at a site called Eridu. Okay, right next to Susiana, where that cylinder seal impression was with a white crown. And Eridu is a really, really important city, a religious city, divine city in Mesopotamian history. In fact, in the Sumerian kings list, it states this: when kingship first descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. So in other words, the very first city on earth where kings ruled and where a great temple was built was at this place called Eridu. An archaeological diagram of what this place looked like shows it as a round island surrounded by a swamp of fresh water covered in reeds, just like the Shebtu that I mentioned right at the beginning. And at the center of the island was a sacred compound upon which they built the first ziggurat or tower temple in Mesopotamia at this place. And it was then abandoned after a period of time, incomplete. And the city was abandoned and left to the drifting sands for centuries. Now, the Egyptians referred to this place where the pharaoh goes to, this Isle of Flame, this primeval mound, as the waters of Nun. in Egyptian. Now, this word nun means nothing in ancient Egypt. But when you realize that this place, this sacred compound, was actually called in Sumerian Nun Ki, the mighty place, then you know that the waters of Nun surround this sacred place called Nun Ki, the primeval temple of the Shebtu gods of legend and myth. This is actually a photograph looking down on the site today. It's in a sorry state at the bottom. The sea has retreated, but you can see the outline of the island here. And at the center, you have the great compound with what remains of the ziggurat, the tower temple, at one end of the sacred enclosure. So the Eridu temple has been reconstructed to look like this. This is actually only the lower temple. This great platform that was constructed behind was intended to be even higher, built in stages, and that was effectively the tower that was left unfinished. You might begin to understand what this is in biblical terms in Genesis, because this is probably the original basis for the story of the Tower of Babel. So Nun Ki, the mighty place, was what the Sumerians called it, but it had another name, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. And it was surrounded by the Abzu, the primeval swamp of creation. This is how it was reconstructed by archaeologists again. So you have the temples with the great port, and around it the buildings of the city itself, which was surrounded again by the great swamp, or the Abzu, the abyss. Eridu's other name was Bab Ilu, which means the gate of the gods. And that is where we get the story of the Tower of Babel from. The tower is not at Babylon. It's at this place, Eridu, where the first tower was created by the Sumerians and left unfinished. And the people then migrated from this place in the dispersion of the nations to different parts of the world, including Egypt and Kush. So here they are setting off on their journey in their reed ships, sailing around Arabia in the oceans. Here's an example of a modern seafarer doing the same journey. One was Thor Heyerdahl, of course, but this has also been done by other people more recently. And they journeyed from ancient Sumer. They also stopped at places like Dilmun, which is Bahrain today, and Magan, which is Oman, and Meluha, which is Pakistan today, the Indus Valley region. They sailed around the Arabian Peninsula into the Red Sea, hugging the coastline, going through the Bab and Mandeb Straits, and they crossed the desert, the eastern desert, from the Red Sea to the Nile in Upper Egypt, where they established themselves as the first two kingdoms, the kingdom of Seth and the kingdom of Horus, before then conquering the north, and some of them moving out into the Mediterranean Sea. And in fact, the Genesis story, of course, refers to these people as the tribe of Cush, the tribe of Mitzrayim, which is the name of Egypt in the Bible, the tribe of Put, which is Libya, and also the tribe of Canaan, which becomes ancient Phoenicia. So that is the end of the beginning of Egyptian civilization, the beginning of pharaonic civilization. It all begins in the deserts with these people crossing over from Mesopotamia. They mix with and relate with the indigenous population to give this wonderful blend, which is different to Mesopotamia, of a combination of the elites of Mesopotamia joining with the indigenous population of Egypt to create the pharaonic civilization. So that's our talk today. I think what we're going to do now is we're going to see if we've got some questions in the chat. And I think Heather is going to actually do that for us. She's going to read out those questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so that's the lecture. Let's see what Heather's got for us now from the questions.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Our first question tonight, we've got Joanne in New York, and she says, fascinating to hear that you can link what we consider history with the birth of writing. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about this. What are the earliest known examples of ancient writing, and how did historians manage to date the birth of writing?
That is a really good question. Okay, so we define the idea that when writing is invented, we start to get records for the first time, and that really is what history is. History is documentation of events, etc. But it actually starts with accounting. The first scribes were accountants. They recorded the amount of grain in bushels that were being harvested. They counted the number of sheep that an owner had for tax purposes. So it all began with accountants, believe it or not, rather than historians. And then it evolved later on into proper narrative. This all happened in the what we call the Sumerian period, around Uruk IV. That's the phase of the city of Uruk. And then obviously it developed into much more like literature and narrative after that. So when we get to the time of Gilgamesh, which is early dynastic 1, which is a later period, then we start to get written records and tales of great heroes, etc., what we call legendary tales. And that then becomes, a little bit later, documentation of actual physical events rather than just narratives. So we'd have the records of campaigns, military campaigns, etc. That goes all the way through Mesopotamia. And of course, it begins in Egypt when the writing appears in Egypt for the first time. And again, we have similar things. We have the names of kings primarily at the beginning, what we call the Seric names with the Horus falcon on the top and the name of the kingman in there. But we also have little text recording events, like the heliacal rising of Sirius, which is the beginning of the Egyptian New Year, recorded in the reign of King Jer, the second king of the first dynasty. And then it becomes, later on, it becomes text about buildings, so building pyramids, etc. We get text about that. We have a new papyrus that's been found fairly recently, talking about the building of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, written by one of the architects. So it's all about daily life then. And then, of course, later on in the New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, we start to get narrative texts of campaigns. So the Great Battle of Kadesh, for instance, of Ramesses II, is a proper account of one of the first battles that we know about in history. So it evolves all the way through this period. Its beginnings are in the pre-dynastic age. And it seems to me that it begins, first of all, in Mesopotamia, and it starts in Egypt slightly later, but it blossoms very quickly. And we have this evolution to what we call hieroglyphic script. Now, hieroglyphs are not an alphabet like you would expect to find today. And Mesopotamian, what we call Akkadian script, also is a syllabic language. It's not an alphabet either. The alphabet comes a little bit later on, but the alphabet itself evolves out of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's what we call Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, which is an alphabet, but they use Egyptian hieroglyphic signs to represent the letters. And that is then given to the Phoenicians eventually, and the Phoenicians give it to the Greeks, and the Greeks, of course, give it to the Latins, the Romans, and we get it in our modern alphabet. So, for instance, the sign of a bull, this sign here, which is like two horns on the face of the bull, rotates throughout history until it becomes our capital letter A. So that's how our alphabet evolves. It comes out of the signs of ancient Egypt, the hieroglyphic signs.
Wonderful, thank you, David. A question here now from Brian. He's in Bremerton in the United States, and he says, do you think there are still more rock paintings to be uncovered in the future, and are you still involved in any current archaeological projects?
Okay, now another good question. I retired from physical archaeology a few years back now. I'm getting a bit old for that. So those expeditions were in the 1990s. People were doing it before that, Arthur Weigel and Winkler, and there are new missions going out there now as well, doing some of the recordings, but it's a vast area. Funnily enough, we don't find it in the Sahara. We don't find this rock art so much in the Sahara Desert. So we're looking really to that area between the Red Sea and the Nile. And there we do see, I would say, thousands of sites there, not just of ships, but we also have hunting scenes as well. We see bovids, we see antelopes, we see people with bows and arrows firing at them. We see animals being lassoed to tame them, to bring them to the Nile Valley, to domesticate wild bulls, etc., to make the herds, the domesticated herds. But of course, then the hippopotami and the elephants and the giraffes disappear as the desert dries out, becomes less savanna and more desert. So they go to the tropical zones, and we don't find them in the desert anymore, but we have the rock art to show that they were there originally. So yes, this continues today. I'm not going to be involved in it so much now, but there are other people doing the work now, and the publications are coming out. But of course, it's not big news in the world of the press today or the internet, because it's more scientific. And so these publications tend to get ignored by the population, but they are very significant, because they tell us about the beginnings of civilization in Africa. So they're very important from that point of view. And it also is this key link between Mesopotamian culture and Egyptian culture, which makes this marriage, this between the Nilotic peoples and the Mesopotamian peoples, that form this magnificent civilization, which we call the pharaonic state.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. A question here from Maud in Boston, and she asks, do historians have an idea of why these rock paintings were made? Was it a form of communication between people at the time, or perhaps they were done with the idea of passing information to future generations?
Now, that is another good question. These are great questions you're giving me. Okay, well, the first thing is, it could also be just like Henry was here. Okay, people tend, when they're traveling around the deserts, to carve their names or whatever it is to show they were there. So some of the art is just doodling. So, you know, maybe a hunter would be waiting for a wild herd to come through and his team before they captured animals or shot those animals, and they would be in the shade and they would pass the time by carving rock art of themselves hunting these animals. We don't have any names, of course, because it's pre-writing, but that's what that is. When it comes to the boats, though, this is something very different. They are telling us something. They're giving us a message about what was happening in the real world. And there were also like signposts, because they were telling future people coming this way, maybe a few years later, also traveling to Egypt from the Red Sea. They were saying, this is the way you go. When you see one of these ships with a man pointing, this is the way you have to go. And indeed, we've even found maps carved on the rock surface showing the wadis and the routes that people should travel. And these are the oldest maps ever been found in the world. They date to a good 1,500 years earlier than any later maps that we've discovered. So they are carved on the rock surfaces, and they have a sense to be able to visualize the landscape and the directions. They don't have to have a balloon or an aeroplane to see the landscape. They imagine it in their heads. They maybe even, as they're walking, they can pace it out, and they're able to accurately draw the directions and the wadis, the complex wadi systems, which enable people to drag their boats from the Red Sea to the Nile. And that was a main key, really. They're saying, come this way, we know how to get here.
Fascinating. Thank you, David. Question here from Carrie in Denver, and she says, is it possible to visit the Eastern Desert region and see those rock paintings for yourself?
Okay. Well, if you go for a trip to Hurghada on the Red Sea, and you go there for scuba diving or just sunbathing on the beach, you can actually hire vehicles to go into the Eastern Desert from that side. It's more difficult to travel from the Nile itself. You have to get special permits from the Antiquity Service to do that, because this rock art is protected now. And so you have to have a mission, basically, to go there. So it's not a tourist attraction in that context. You do have when you go on the ships, the big ships that come into Hurghada on the Red Sea, coaches take you to the Valley of the Kings, to Luxor. So you actually travel the routes through the desert, through the Wadi Hammamat, especially on tarmac roads today. So you can be whisked through there, but you're not given the time to stop and go searching for the rock art. And to be quite honest with you, you do need a four-wheel drive vehicle to get into the desert itself off the tarmac roads, because the buses will get stuck in the sand. And so you probably have to organize a mission of your own to do so. But there are groups of what you call tourist industry people who do desert survey trips and desert trips, especially into the Sahara. But in the Sahara, you don't find the same rock art. So the Sahara is visited a lot by these 4x4s, but the Eastern Desert is much more difficult to get into, to be honest. And you won't be able to do that purely as a tourist. You'd have to do it as a part of an archaeological mission.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. Next question here is from Pamela, also in Denver, and she says, very interesting that these ancient artifacts suggest trade was happening with people as far away as Asia. Can you tell us a bit more about what is known of how the ancient Egyptians traded? Do you know what they would have exported in return for those precious stones?
Okay, and that is a question that's been worrying archaeologists and Egyptologists for decades and decades, because it doesn't seem to be trade. It seems to be the arrival of people bringing goods with them from their own civilization, from their own culture. And the reason we say that is because there's nothing in reverse. There is no artifacts and materials from Egyptian culture found in Mesopotamia at this time. So it's a one-way traffic, it's a one-way street. It's coming from Mesopotamia into Egypt through the desert into Upper Egypt, remember, not the northern part, but the southern part of Egypt. So it's showing you it must have come by sea. It's not come over land through what we call Canaan today. That would be the north of Egypt. It's coming into the south of Egypt, and it seems to be one-way traffic, which suggests what the artifacts we're finding are actually the possessions of the people who are moving from Mesopotamia into Egypt. And so it's not really trade at this stage. Trade happens a lot later, when we start to see Egyptian pottery and materials coming into southern Canaan, but that's in the Old Kingdom period. It's not in the pre-dynastic era.
Thank you, David. Question here from Diana. She's in Allentown in the United States, and she says, do we know why the Mesopotamians created the decorative cones? What did they stand for, and who within their society would have had them?
Well, that is amazing. Yes, we only find them in Mesopotamia, in Uruk, the city of Uruk. And it's peculiar to that one city, and it's to do with the two main temples there. Primarily the goddess Inanna, who later on is really the most important deity, a female deity in Mesopotamia. So she is actually Astarte, and all the other gods of that period, they all got different names, but she's essentially the same goddess. She's the great queen of nature, as it were. So she's the one who looks after the animals, etc. And it's mainly in her temple compound where we find these unique cones. And they are unique because they're a strange thing. You have to have a wet plastered surface quite deep, and then you insert these rather long cones into it in various colours to form the patterns, like a mosaic that you'd have in a Roman villa, for instance, on the floor. So we don't know why they did it, apart from purely decorative art. It must have looked stunning when it was originally constructed, not as we see it today, which is, thousands of years later. So it's simply art for art's sake, and it beautifies the temple compound. And so when it arrives in Egypt, it was quite a shock for archaeologists to find it in the delta of Egypt. Why would we find it there? And it's not on the same scale as we find it in Mesopotamia, but it means that Mesopotamians must have come with that idea and used it to decorate something in the delta, which we've now lost. The actual building construction has disappeared, but there are the remains of these cones there. So it's simply art for art's sakes, but it's all connected to religious compounds and goddesses. It seems to be part of Inanna's temple compound, where it came from originally.
Wonderful, thank you, David. A question here now from Richard in the United States, and he says, how does the Ogdoad relate to the primordial gods you mentioned? Who are Anuket, Kut and Ket, Umun and Amunet, and Nun and Nunet?
Yes, Richard knows his Egyptology. Well, that's the point, isn't it, really? They're the same number, 8 gods. Although the 8 gods in the Ogdoad are male and female sets of 4, whereas the Shebtiu are 8 individual gods that are all male gods. But there must be a connection with this number 8 and the 7 Apkallu and Thoth, the idea of the 7 sages and the 1, together making 8. So that's what you're talking about there. The Ogdoad comes into the Egyptian civilization itself, the actual time period of the pharaohs, whereas when we look at the Shebtiu gods, they are mythical. They come from an earlier period before the pharaonic state appears, and they are reflected in the Ptolemaic temple inscription. So they're thousands of years after the events. They're actually at the end of Egyptian civilization when the Greco-Roman era is going on. So we're looking at places like Edfu and Dendera and places like that. But it's specifically to Edfu because Edfu is at the end of the Wadi from the Red Sea to the Nile, where the tribe of Nekhen, the original followers of Horus, were based in the first place. So that temple is of hoary age in terms of the original foundation. And it's only the Greco-Roman version, which is the latest edition of that temple. So they must have had knowledge, written in papyrus or whatever it was, of these myths of the Shebtiu gods. And those names, those Shebtiu gods, are the earlier form of the later Ogdoad, which then becomes, as I say, four sets of male and female gods and goddesses. So it's evolved out of it, and it must have a similarity. And you could probably try to work out when you look at the Ogdoad and the actual names of those gods and compare them to some of these other figures. So we have, Horus as a possibility there, and you've got the possibility of Thoth himself or Jehuti. But the other ones, their names are very strange names. They're very, very, very weird names that you get after the figure of the sailor. they come into very strange names, which you can't really identify with any modern or any later Egyptian gods, I'm afraid. So there probably is a connection, but it's very hard to actually make the connection.
Thank you, David. Question here now from Charles in Canada, and he says, do you know of any association between the pre-dynastic Egyptians who carved the animals in stone and the Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which also has carved animals in stone?
Göbekli Tepe, yes. Okay, Charles. Well, the thing is, that's much earlier. Okay, if we're talking about the end of the Neolithic now, with Göbekli Tepe, and it's hunter-gatherer society there, which is coming together for rituals, probably astronomical rituals, events in the sky. Because if you've been to Göbekli Tepe, it's on a sloping hill, and you look out and you have a huge, vast horizon, and the sky there, the night sky there, is very, very visible in that place. So they're probably hunter-gatherers coming from different parts of the region, arriving there for rituals, annual rituals, biannual rituals, etc. And if you know the site, you'll know that they haven't found any burials there of humans. So it's not a settlement. People don't live there and die there and get buried there. It's a ceremonial place that people come to for rituals. And so that's the Neolithic period. It's thousands of years before what we're talking about here now in Mesopotamia. So these people are living in the Zagros Mountains and in the Taurus Mountains, in the area that we would call the Edenic landscape of the Bible, and they are moving down later on into the Mesopotamian plain to become what we call the Mesopotamian culture. So they start in the mountains and they arrive in the Mesopotamian plain. But remember this, the gods of the Mesopotamians, they lived on mountains because they built these artificial ziggurats, these artificial mountains, which they call Kor, which means mountain, on which the house of the god rested at the top. And so they are telling us through their architecture that the gods and the people who worship the gods, i.e. their ancestors, came from the mountains down onto the plain, onto the valley. So they are the primeval ancestors of the primeval civilizations of Mesopotamia that you talk about at Göbekli Tepe. And they are pre the Neolithic Revolution. They are pre-settlement. They are pre-agriculture. They are pre-domestication of animals. That's the period before we start to see civilization evolving and establishing itself in the Mesopotamian plain.
Fantastic, thank you. Question here now from David in the United States, and he says, can you comment on the recent discovery in the western region of Saudi Arabia that show rock drawings to indicate humans crossed from East Africa to settle in Arabia's empty quarter and may then have migrated up to Mesopotamia and later to Egypt?
That is also a possibility. Yes, definitely. Arabia was very much like the Eastern Desert in the sense that it wasn't pure desert at the time. We have carvings of bovids on the desert landscape in Arabia, just as we do in the Eastern Desert as well. And so we have similar art, which suggests that there were people passing through that region, which was much easier to cross than it is today, even though we have vehicles to do it today. It's much, much drier today than it was in what we call the Neolithic wet phase, which we're talking about now, which is when these people were able to do the hunting and the gathering in that area and to pass through the region. So yes, people could certainly have come in that direction as well. But it seems from the architecture and the legendary mythologies that we have in the Mesopotamian literature that they perceive that their ancestors came from the mountains to the north. In other words, from the Zagros mountain region. That is not to say there wasn't a movement in the other direction as well, but it doesn't seem that at any stage that any Egyptians, pre-Egyptians or pre-civilization Egyptians, moved into Mesopotamia. So if they did do this journey across Arabia, they probably wouldn't have gone via Egypt. One might have gone at the southern tip, what we call Yemen today, might have crossed there and passed up through to Mesopotamia. That is a possibility.
Thank you, David. Question here from Lisbeth in Canada, and she says, thank you for mentioning Inanna. What other goddesses are there for this period, especially in the estuary areas?
Ooh, okay. Now, I'm not a Mesopotamian scholar, so you've got to have to be careful here with me. I might be guessing a little bit here. Okay, so the word Nin in Sumerian means lady. Okay, so En is the word for Lord. So Enlil, Lord Wind, Enki, Lord Earth. So we have something called Nin. So the name again is, let me think if I can remember it rightly. Ninki, I think the name is, and it means Lady of Life. Okay, now that is a title that was given to Eve in the biblical text, the mother of all the living. And this lady, Nin, the Lady of Life, okay, is in the story of Enki, who fights against the great god Enlil and the pantheon of gods. He rebels against them because he's actually the one who loves mankind, Enki. He's the one that tries to protect mankind from the anger of the gods. He's the one who warns the flood hero to build an ark when Enlil decides to send the storms, the great rainstorms that causes the great deluge. So he whispers through the reed shrine to Utnapishtim, and before that Ziusudra, and before that Atrahasis. These are the names of the flood heroes in the various literatures. And he tells him to build an ark. So Enki is a lover of man. He's the friend of man, he's called. He's called the wise god as well. So he rebels against Enlil and the rest of the gods, and he's made ill by the gods. So he's dying, okay? And so Inanna sends this lady of the rib, a goddess, to heal Enki. And the word, I think I'm just trying to think what the name of the word is. I'll go, that's right, it's Ninti, not Ninki, Ninti. The word T means the life, so it's the Lady of Life, but it also means rib. So what it basically is a story about the lady who comes and preserves the life of Enki, and is confused in the biblical text as Eve, the Lady of the Rib, who was born out of Adam's side. And so the Mesopotamian story seems to be the original story upon which the story of the birth of Eve from the rib of Adam is created in the Genesis story. So that goddess that we're talking about now, Ninti, the Lady of the Rib, or the Lady of Life, is probably the same reference to the mother of all the living, which is Eve, or Hawa in the Bible. So that goddess is very important in the story as well. But really, Inanna is the main goddess of the period. She is the one, she's the queen, if you like. She's the queen of heaven. Okay, so she's all the great gods that you find in Mesopotamia evolve out of her, the female versions. And she's equivalent to Isis in Egypt as well, and also Hathor, the mother goddess. So she's the original Sumerian goddess who becomes the great female goddess of all the civilizations of the ancient world, really.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. Question here now from John in Pittsburgh, and he says, what was the climate like in the Eastern Desert where the rock art was done? How much water was in the wadis to enable dragging the boats from the Red Sea to the Nile?
Okay, good question. So in this period, what we call the Neolithic wet phase, and which comes to an end really about the 3rd dynasty in Egypt, just before the beginning of the pyramids, the great pyramids were built at Khufu and Khafre. It's called the Neolithic wet phase, and it dies off slowly, but it means that there was much more rain in that earlier period, and the Sahara itself was not a desert, it was a savanna region. They found, evidence that people were living there and herding in that area, and the same goes for the Eastern Desert as well. That was savanna. So it was a grassland area, limited amount of water, but certainly enough there. And we have found in the Eastern Desert lots of flat areas that were once water holes. So they were large lakes in that area, very shallow lakes, but certainly drinking water, which the herds that were migrating through the region would have used on their journeys, and where the hunters used to wait for the animals to come so that they could either kill them or capture them. So certainly there was a lot of water in that region at the time. But by the time that the pharaohs came to power, it began to recede and became drier and drier in that period. Now, why that was is difficult to say. It may be something to do with the shifting climate, so that the tropical zone in the Neolithic wet phase had moved further north, and then later on it moved back down south to the equator again, pulling with it the wet weathers, and then introducing the desert areas again. And that same sort of thing happened again in the Bible story of the great famine in Egypt in Joseph's time, where you have a great amount of water arriving in Egypt, which caused the lack of being able to actually harvest the crops, because you couldn't plough the fields because the fields were flooded for a lot longer than possible. Whereas in Canaan, there was a drought. So what happened is that the Sahara zone had pushed northwards, the Arabian zone had pushed northwards and made it a lot drier in Canaan and the Levant. Whereas Egypt had an abundance of water, which also stopped them from growing crops, which caused a famine there, which caused the tropical zone had moved northwards. So maybe that's what happened also in the Neolithic wet phase. We had a more tropical zone further north, then it shifted back down again to cause the desiccation in the desert area and the drying up of the eastern desert.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. I think that's nearly all we've got time for tonight. So we'll just finish on a bit more of a personal question. So we have Teresa here in Roanoke, Virginia, and she says, fascinating to hear about your experiences in the desert. I'm interested, how did you become an Egyptologist? And can you tell us a bit more about your background?
Oh, how long have we got? So yes, I started writing Egyptian hieroglyphs when I was about 7 years old. I'm not sure why. I wrote a list of all the pharaohs from the 1st dynasty to the 30th dynasty in hieroglyphs with their Greek names and also what we call our anglicized names today. I don't know where that interest came from. I went to Egypt the first time at the age of 9, and at the time King Farouk had been thrown out of Egypt in the revolution, and so my mother and I and a few other people commandeered his royal steamer, paddle steamer, and we sailed all the way from Cairo to Abu Simbel through the British Dam and the lock system there at Aswan. And I was given the great brass key in the form of an ankh and sent down the gangplank before dawn on the beach in front of Abu Simbel before it was moved up after the Lake Nasser was constructed, and given this key and told to go and open the great doors of Abu Simbel temple on my own. And as I did so, the sun rose on the eastern horizon behind me across the river and lit my way all the way through that magnificent temple to the Holy of Holies on the far end inside the mountain. And that was my introduction to Egypt for the first time. And I've been in love with Egypt ever since. Must have traveled there hundreds of times over the years, getting on a bit now. In fact, I'm going out there again in a week from now, actually, for a Nile cruise for 2 weeks. So yeah, so I've always loved the subject. I've had other attractions in my life as well, rock music and other things, but I've always loved Egypt, and I've loved it since childhood.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for your time today, David, for answering so many of our guest questions.
It was my pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thanks very much.